Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, this week, I want to address something that I'm going to call the interspecies catch-22. And what I want to look at is this idea of, we've been tracking along the lines of just theoretically how life, just kind of the general topic of life, could have evolved or could have gotten to where we find ourselves today through the time that's been available here on Earth. And we haven't even really addressed that topic as to whether or not there's enough time for a Neo-Darwinian theory to have worked. There's a lot of thought coming out on that now that if you assume the oldest possible age of the Earth, that scientists would come up with something like 4 billion years. And obviously there are people who dispute that, but let's say 4 billion years. Is 4 billion years enough time to actually have a Neo-Darwinian process arrive at the abundance and diversity of life that we see around us today? And there's an increasing school of thought that the answer to that is no. That there's just simply 4 billion years is not enough time to jump through all of the hoops. But I don't want to start on that tonight. What I want to look at is this idea, and again, we've been talking about this, which philosophical notion has the best explanatory power for explaining how we got here. And I think we're going to see the final nail in the coffin in this journey of Neo-Darwinian theory tonight as we look at this idea of the development of multiple species and what we see around us, this enormous diversity of life. And I want to give a couple of illustrations to kind of show this problem. A couple of my favorite Saturday morning cartoon characters who I have recently learned while researching this. I feel like I've been misled a little bit. Shocking that Saturday morning cartoons weren't 100% accurate. But let's talk about this. And I want to pick on one creature. And we're going to say it is the lonesome coyote. And our friend the coyote, if we look at him as a creature and we look at where he stands in the food chain and things like that, coyote's doing fairly well for itself. It's got 4 legs that allow it to move very quickly. It's got a pretty ferocious set of teeth. It's got a good coat for survival in cold conditions. It's good size. It's not too big. An elephant-sized coyote would be really intimidating and scary, but probably couldn't move very fast necessarily. It's not too small. A chipmunk-sized coyote might be a little bit less intimidating. So it's not a bad size. Not as big as a wolf, but it's still, you can look at it and you can say this is an apex predator within its region. Obviously, there's a lot bigger predators, so apex predator is probably not a good term, but it is a solid predator towards the top of the list of the food chain. So when we look at our friend the coyote, and I've got a lot of ranchers out there who are going, there's nothing friendly about the coyote, and I very much understand and respect that. Even here where I live in kind of a rural area, coyotes are real problematic for house pets and things like that too. So not a friendly animal as we look at it. But from an evolutionary perspective, if we look at the coyote and we say, well, how did the coyote get here? Let's briefly walk through the journey. And everything has got to walk through the first steps of the journey. Obviously, we talked a little bit last week about how do we get here? And we talked last week about how naturalists are running out of chance. They're running out of luck because so many times they have to pump into the equation luck. Luck gets us past this step. Luck gets us past that step and all of these things, when clearly we can see the hand of intelligence at work in many of these steps. So again, we covered that in the last episode. Please refer to last week's episode if you want to look at that. But as we talk about this, let's kind of walk through how do we get to a coyote and what are the steps that a coyote has to go through. All right, so obviously creation of the universe, everything coming from nothing, fine-tuning of the universe, fine-tuning of our galaxy, solar system, and planet, all of that stuff to get us to Earth and where we are today. So let's say we've gotten there. Then you've got to make the jump from lifelessness to life. You've got to explain the production of DNA and the information contained inside of DNA. You've got to explain the complexity of the cell, not just the first cell, but the cells that make up us, that we've had so much fun with Richard Dawkins' quote talking about the eukaryotic cell. The formation of complex traits, the formation of complex functions, the formation of complex systems and how all of these various things have to come together to produce that animal that we talked about. And when we think about some of these traits, breathing, walking, mobility, and you think about that in terms of, a creature that has, if you think about our arms and legs, or canines in this case, all of the various, functions that we have in terms of foot or hand, upper portion of the limb, lower portion and upper portion of the limb, the joint here, the joint here. And so whether we're talking about 4 legs or 2 arms and 2 legs, that movement, that ability for movement, seeing, smelling, hearing, touch, balance. If we start breaking into the systems, the reproductive system that we talked about for a whole episode, the circulatory system, the digestive system, the nervous system. I mean, if you look at all of these different things and we break down in our coyote, all of the various things that have to evolve over the course of time. And at every step along the way, whether we were talking about Richard Dawkins' journey to the top of Mount Improbable, every single one of these has to make this journey to the top of Mount Improbable to go from no sight to sight, no hearing to hearing, no balance to balance. And it's not just the development of the functions. It was, and we've looked at this before, it's the development of the concept. That at some point, sight was not a concept that existed in life here on Earth. And yet today, remarkably, all living creatures, obviously not in the plant world, but all living creatures, when we look at fish or mammals or whatever it may be, insects, have the ability of sight to varying degrees, slightly different designs. But again, sight is a concept that is shared across nearly all life on the planet. You've got other more unique features like flying or swimming or things like that also had to develop over time. So when you look at each one of these, what you have is this massive, massive list of things that have to start from scratch. And it's not just the development of the function, it's the development of the concept, which then ultimately has to develop into the function. It flies in the face of everything we're told about Darwinian evolution, that it's supposed to be. Remember, we've gone through those quotes of Richard Dawkins, that Darwinian evolution is a miserly accountant, and it doesn't allow for these extravagancies. And of course, that's this conundrum, this catch-22 for the naturalist, because, well, how then do you explain how it would have to take millions of years for something to develop the ability for sight or the ability for smell or all of these things? How is it that the body is patient enough to allow for that development from nothing to a fully functioning something? And obviously there's steps along the way that make it better, but we're going to talk about tonight why that doesn't necessarily work. So when you're looking at this and thinking about all of this, you have this enormous number of remarkably improbable things that all have to come together to bring us our creature. And like I said, tonight we're going to pick on the coyote. But as I mentioned, I feel a little bit misled by one of my favorite Saturday morning cartoons, because the coyote's nemesis, as great as we know the coyote to be, his nemesis is, of course, the roadrunner. Or so I thought. So in researching this, I feel like I need to address the fallacies put out there by Saturday morning cartoons. And so I feel like I need to address this properly. Did you know that the roadrunner actually is capable of short bursts of flight? Did not know that. In cartoons, the roadrunner seems to have the ability to just naturally levitate in air where there is no land underneath him, but the coyote always falls to the bottom of the canyon floor. So go figure that. But the roadrunner can fly for brief periods of time, but they prefer to run. Now, if you were to ask me who could run faster, the coyote or the roadrunner, I would clearly have said the roadrunner. We've all seen it. His legs become this incredibly blurry picture of wheels spinning, and off he runs. Amazingly, that's not true. I'm sure you're shocked to hear that. I was amazed that roadrunners can sprint at up to 20 miles an hour, and they can fly for short distances, like I said. Coyotes can run upwards of the mid-40s, over twice as fast. And I'm going to be honest, I was a little bit surprised by that. I had never actually thought about it. It makes perfect sense when you look at the size of the coyote and 4 legs compared to 2, and the roadrunner's skinny little Skinny little legs, but I'm going to be honest, I feel a little bit misled by Saturday morning cartoons. So go figure for what that's worth. But let's set that aside for a moment, and let's assume that our old friend the coyote gets tired of falling to the bottom of the canyon floor, and there's a little poof of smoke, when he hits the bottom of the floor. What are our coyote's options? Because buying, goods from Acme Company never seemed to help him along the way. So you would assume at some point the only answer to this problem is something that's going to need to happen in the evolutionary process on our planet. We're going to need to evolve new species. At some point, we're going to assume that our coyote needs to evolve into a bird to be able to catch the roadrunner and deal with the roadrunner, because clearly flying is going to be the only thing that's going to help him stop from falling to the bottom of the canyon floor. The problem is, how does that work? And this is the conundrum. This is the catch-22 between species. If you assume that one species evolved on its own, we have a couple of different choices in all of this, because when you look at all life, like I said, life tends to share an enormous number of similar traits. Seeing, hearing, the ability to move from place to place within whatever environment that it's in. With fish, it's swimming. With creatures on land, it's swimming, it's running or walking or flying, perhaps. When you look at that, we're faced with two remarkably unlikely options, but one of the two has to be it. This is one of the problems that we talked about before when we talked about the lack of living missing links. So if you try to go from a creature like a coyote, for example, to a bird, and because we're told that dinosaurs, one theory of it is that dinosaurs evolved and became the birds. Okay, so the problem that you've got between a fully functioning coyote, let's say, or a dinosaur, take your pick, and a bird is that in between, there isn't much middle ground between flying and not flying. I know Buzz Lightyear, coined the phrase, it's not, I think it was Woody coined the phrase, it's not flying, you're falling with style. Okay, falling with style is not going to cut it in most cases, because if a creature tries to jump off the cliff and fly to escape a predator and they can't fly, it's going to be our old friend the coyote with a poof at the bottom of the canyon floor. And that doesn't end well outside of the cartoon world. So how do you go between not flying and flying? And part of our problem is going to be illustrated for us by the fact that, again, the coyote sits pretty much at the top of the food chain in its area as a predator. And so a creature trying to evolve the ability to fly, if you look at that, what is its skill set that's going to get it there? Because unless it can climb really well to get off the ground, it's not going to be able to fly, and so therefore it's going to be eaten. Because coyotes, I said earlier, our old friend the coyotes are nasty creatures. They will go after household pets. I know a friend who lost a dog to one. They will go after cattle. They will go after a great many things. They are rather nasty little critters. And you don't necessarily want to have to deal with that if you're another member of the animal kingdom. The whole idea of survival of the fittest comes into play here. Nature is not going to be forgiving for a creature in mid-evolutionary change. So if you're somewhere on this end of I can't fly and on this end I'm able to fly, even just rudimentary, in between there's a whole lot of death, whether it's falling or being eaten by other predators. And I struggle to understand how you can go from point A to point B, because if you look at the bone structure, the body structure, the makeup of a bird compared to, let's say, our friend the coyote, birds have feathers, birds have very unique arms and legs, very unique body shapes, all of which contribute to a bird's ability to fly. So when you look at all of those things put together, if you have a coyote that has fur and teeth and four legs and the incredibly unique body shape that it has to be able to, let's be honest, eat other members of the animal kingdom, and you have a bird, on the other hand, that needs an incredibly different body shape to be able to achieve the ability to fly, how is it that they share so many commonalities, but they both evolve so very separately? We have one of two choices, and neither one is good. And so that's what I want to put on the table tonight as we talk about this. Option number one is that you have one creature that evolves all of these traits. So it evolves the ability to eat, let's throw that out, I'm sorry, seeing, hearing, smelling, balance, movement, all of those traits that it's going to need to be able to survive in a Neo-Darwinian world. Survival of the fittest, we all know the term. So you have one creature that evolves all of these different traits. And then from that one creature, at some point in its development, then it began to break off into the other various forms. So it began, it ultimately became fish. It ultimately became birds. It ultimately became not just dogs and things in that. We understand how you can look at a coyote and a wolf and see similarities, and a coyote and dog and see similarities. But it's real difficult to see those similarities once you start jumping species between coyotes and horses, or coyotes and elephants, or things like that. So you either have one creature that evolved all of these enormously complex traits, and then that creature broke early in the evolutionary process. And granted, after millions and millions and hundreds of millions, if not billions of years of developing sight and hearing and taste and balance and movement and all of these things, you're going to have to develop all of these different things, because once you break that creature up, you have a much better chance of explaining how we ended up with so many creatures having sight, how we have so many creatures that have smell, that have hearing, that have, the ability, that have a nervous system, that have a respiratory system, or whatever it may be. All of these complex systems, it would seem to make sense that you say, well, the earliest ancestor had to have evolved a lot of these traits for all of these same traits to be present in so much of life. That seems to be a reasonable option, but it seems next to impossible how you would go from species to species at that point. You could potentially account for all the various traits and systems to have evolved because it came from one creature, and along that one creature's line, it kept improving and improving and improving, and that's how you ended up with, let's say, sight, for example, a trait that nearly all life shares. That would make sense in how it got there. But that is fraught with problems, because how do you jump from that creature into the other various species? The answer to that would be option number two, and option number two would be, well, what you ultimately had happen is, early on in the evolutionary process, the creatures broke into their various species, and then they developed all of those traits and functions and things like that. That seems even less likely, because it would be remarkable to me that one species could develop sight, that one species could develop hearing, that one species could develop the joints and the things that we see, or a cardiovascular system, or whatever it might be. But to assume that every species developed remarkably similar functions argues against that. And again, this gets back to that problem. Where are the living missing links? The living missing links seem to be an enormous problem for option number one. And again, a similar trait here. The problem with option number two is you would think we would find whole species that never develop the ability to see, unless somehow we're going to say that the ability to see is a mundane, routine trait that any creature could develop, because every creature did. Does this become the new anthropic principle? Well, we look around and we see that every creature can see, therefore sight must have been really easy to do. Really? Because when you look at the enormously complex functions going on in your eye, sight doesn't seem easy at all. Sight seems next to impossible, which again was something that Darwin was confronted by his peers. So we seem to be confronted here with this interspecies catch-22. How is it possible that we see all of these species with all of these remarkably different traits, functions, systems, and everything else? How could you have both? If you had one species that had all of them, it would seem to me mathematically and logically to be a miracle. I mean, basically what we're saying is, we take Richard Dawkins' parable of climbing Mount Improbable. Apparently there's an escalator right to the top of Mount Improbable, and every creature just hops on the escalator, and there's sight, and there's vision, and there's hearing, and there's all these different things. Apparently, the evolution of these traits, no matter how we look at them and say, my goodness, that seems complex, the answer has to come back and be, obviously it was easy, because nearly all land animals can hear to amazing degrees. Nearly all animals can see to varying degrees, but most of them to remarkable degrees. The fossil record is incredibly unhelpful in answering this question for us because all life seems to have suddenly popped up. Not all life, most life. Most life, we seem to have gone from just a couple teeny tiny things to this huge Cambrian explosion of life, where life in all of its enormous complexity, highly developed, seems to show up all at once. So the fossil record doesn't give us any help in answering this question, and it doesn't help Darwin, it buries him, because the fossil record ultimately addresses this same conundrum. How is it possible that life, with all of these traits, highly evolved, all show up at the same time in the same Cambrian strata? And this is the fundamental problem that we've got when we look across the species. It's got to be one of these two options. And I know what some people will say, well, there's a third option. It's a bit of both. I get that, but explain that again. Walk through that. Which is it? Because if you kind of lean into option number 2, because option number 2 fixes the problem of how we got all the different species, you're still stuck with the issue of how did all the species end up with remarkably similar traits, because they all couldn't have evolved the same traits in the same way in the same amount of time. There's a time limit going on. There's a clock behind the scenes ticking in all of this. And when we look around us, what do we see? We don't see living examples of missing links. And this is the problem. When we think about Darwin's theory and how we apply it functionally, there's no good answer to this question. And always behind the scenes, that clock is ticking until Earth grows cold and dies. We do not have an infinite amount of time from when this planet formed to where we are in the process. And whether you believe that's 6,000 years or whether you believe that's 4 billion years, the clock is ticking and it's not on Darwin's favor. It's not helping Darwin at all here. This catch-22, there's only one real answer to it. Naturalism cannot put an answer on the table. But the logical answer to all of this is life was created by an intelligent designer who created all life in an enormously short geological period of time, which the fossil record shows. And that creator created life in a remarkably advanced state of evolution, which the fossil record shows. And that could explain the conundrum between option number 1, how we have all of these life forms with all of these remarkably different traits and systems, and option number 2, how we have all these various species that have all of these different functions. So when we look at those two side by side, naturalism cannot put an answer on the table because it is a catch-22 from a naturalist perspective. But the creationists can look at this and say, well, no, wait a minute, there is a third option. There is another option on the table. The other option on the table in all of this is they were created by an intelligent creator over a very short period of time, and that does account for all of the diversity of life that we see with all of the various functions, all of the various traits, and at the same time, all of the various different species that share so many of those traits. And that is the catch-22 that we're talking about this week. We are getting very close, and I'm not exactly sure how we're going to wrap this up over the next couple of weeks, so bear with me and we'll see where these next few episodes go. I hope you liked this week's episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. And you can reach out to us on our website at prooftograce.com. Lots of helpful resources for you there. And you can reach out to us via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.